Hey folks, welcome. We will give people a couple minutes to trickle in and we'll get started. Looks like we already have quite a few people on the call today, so this is going to be a busy meeting. Can everyone see my screen okay, by the way?
Yeah, looking good.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, we'll give people 1.5 minutes, so we'll start at 10:02 on the mark. All right, cool. We'll go ahead and get started. Dan should be here in a second. He's just in that room back there getting his Zoom set up so he can also talk. I assume he's having issues. I haven't heard any like yells from the room though, so we should be good. All right, we have a busy agenda, so we'll get started. We'll try to keep this an open conversation. I'll keep watching chat, so if people want to type there, if they're more comfortable, I'll bring up comments. I think the sort of way I've structured this agenda, just because we have a lot of stuff to go through, is one, want to have some meta conversations around A, our priorities, make sure everyone's lined up on that. B, our decision-making process, make sure everyone's lined up around that, and then kind of jump into a bunch of very specific issues for different FIPs that people have proposed that are in various stages, ranging from this is done and ready to ship, and we just want to make sure no one has objections, to this is early and very ideation phase, and we want to collect a lot of feedback before we come back, before people come back with a draft. And some of them are from like people on the Warpcast team, some of them are from people in other teams and so on. So we'll kind of just hand over the mic as we go and talk through different proposals. All right, getting started with number one. So priority. So we talked about this 2 meetings ago. Just wanted to rehash this. I think the number one priority for us is permissionless hubs. And what that means is anyone who wants to run a hub can run a hub without having to go through any steps, go through any issues. And the second priority is, once hubs are stable, is going to permissionless signups. So making sure that any app developer who wants to onboard a user into their application has complete and total freedom to onboard that user into their app. So those are the 2 things that we're optimizing for. Want to pause there and see if that resonates with everyone. If anyone has any questions, if anyone's surprised or has other things that they're like, oh no, I thought we were focusing on X instead of Y. Okay, great. Second one is decision-making process. So we've sort of implicitly operated with the decision-making process where like stuff just kind of happens and gets shipped, but I wanted to make it a little more explicit. And we have this page here where we kind of wrote up our very, very brief philosophy on how to make changes. So high level, I think it's very IETF-like, the way we've operated and the way we'll continue to operate, which is rough consensus and running code, right? If somebody comes up with a good idea, has a practically implementable proposal, and can get most people to buy in, it is very likely that that idea will get shipped and that everyone will kind of agree around it and fix. That's kind of how things have gone. And we've actually had some pretty big changes where external developers have come in, like people new to the protocol, like KC, and they've had examples of things like, hey, protobufs are way more efficient than flat buffers, made those changes and got everyone rallied around them, and we've actually made those protocol changes. I do think it's worth talking about what happens when people disagree. I think the ideal outcome is people sort of get to rough consensus and move onwards, but there's kind of 3 different groups that all have some sort of form of veto control over the other. You have protocol devs, who, can choose to merge changes into like their hubs and contracts. And you can imagine that there'll be many different implementations of hubs like their Ethereum clients. There's app devs who choose which hubs to run and whether to download the new changes and actually run the changes that the protocol devs propose. And then there's users who choose which apps they want to use. And so all groups have some level of control over the other. And so if there's some great disagreement and one party completely defects and starts doing something against the interest of everybody else in the network, people can kind of work around them. If the protocol devs aren't merging a change that everyone else wants, people can fork that repo and run it. If one app dev is not making the change that all their users and all the protocol devs want, people can migrate to different apps. And so there's checks and balances across the whole system. And then the FIP process specifically is a more concrete way of building consensus around protocol changes. So this is more of a standard of saying, hey, here's a way you can express an idea in a format that everyone can kind of wrap their heads around. And here's like a workflow where you can go from I have an idea to let's get it implemented that allows you to reach this rough consensus process. But it's a very open process. There's no restriction on who can open an FIP. There's some requirements for what you need to have in it to move through different stages. And at the end of the day, you have to either implement it yourself or convince someone who can implement it to implement it. And that's kind of how the FIP gets into production. Okay, I've talked a lot here, but I want to pause and see if people have any questions or comments on this topic. Okay, everyone bought into this general idea of like rough consensus and using FIPs and feel pretty good about it? Sweet. I see some nodding heads, so we'll keep moving. Okay, so tactical priority, one of the things we want to do is make sure like big applications, and I use that term very, very loosely, are not dependent on Warpcast APIs. More specifically, I think it's okay to use Warpcast APIs, but we don't want apps to be dependent on data that are available through the Warpcast APIs that are not available on hubs. So our ideal situation is that there's sort of like no special data that Warpcast is providing that applications need in order to be successful, because that makes Warpcast a dependency, and that's really not good for Farcaster if apps have to depend on Warpcast. So the thing that we want to do is, as an example, make sure that follows are decentralized into the protocol. So if follows are actually an important reason for why people are still using Warpcast APIs, Warpcast should either stop doing them or actually, decentralize them at the protocol level so that everyone can get them directly from hubs and start using them. So that's the general model behind like API usage on Warpcast. One of the things I wanted to just pulse check with developers in the room is, especially from Jason and DF, is like, how's it going? Any feedback for like things that are happening on the protocol side? Anything that we can be doing better, or any way that we can help with this migration off of Warpcast APIs to hubs?
David, you want to go first?
Oh, Jason, you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we are, as I mentioned, our plan has been to migrate off of Warpcast APIs entirely by the end of May, and we've been putting a plan towards that. Our backend is Golang, so the complications there. And yeah, I just the one I'm not able to speak about it intelligently enough, Varun, but the thing you posted yesterday about the database solution, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but it's not, I think it was a Postgres database. It wouldn't be helpful to us. I think Aman was struggling to figure out what kind of feedback to give to you, because using it wouldn't be helpful to us, but he got a headache and he's going to reply to you tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, we for others in the room who aren't caught up on this proposal, one of the things that we thought might be helpful for developers is if we actually build a small adapter that makes it easy that you can install as like a Docker container or in your application itself that says, hey, connect to a hub, connect to your database, and it will just populate a table with stuff in your database. I think we've got some really good feedback from people where if we build it in the way that it is currently proposed, I think it will be very useful for one or two developers, but not actually more generalizable to other people for reasons that Jason's using MongoDB, somebody else wants an event queue, yada, yada, yada. So I don't think this current iteration of the design is the right form, because we don't want to build something that one person uses. We want to actually build something that's more generalizable. So we're going to take this feedback, go back to the drawing board and see if there's some way we can do it. Or this just intrinsically might be one of those problems where technology meets just different platforms and everyone has a slightly different configuration and needs to do something slightly different. And there actually is no magic build a library that helps everybody situation. And that also might be okay. This just might be the end of where hubs can be generalized and where people have to start integrating it into their own stacks. But cool, if anyone has not commented on that ticket and has opinions or thoughts or feelings, we'd love to hear from you on that, and we'd love to help.
Varun, just the other thing is specifically about our migration, I can tell you that by Monday, we think latest, we'll be running our own hub for Jam.
Awesome.
And have one up for AirStack by middle of next week as well.
Awesome, that's great.
Yeah.
Sweet. I think we'll kind of use this as a litmus check to make sure that we can safely eliminate dependencies on Warpcast, and I think that'll be a really big milestone if we can get Jam and any of the other applications in the room fully over to using hubs. Okay, another topic that I want to talk about, we discussed this several months ago in the migration, but one of the challenges we have is there's a lot of users who are using Farcaster pre-hubs. So before we had this new data format, before we had this new signer, and they created messages in the old V1 format. And back in January, we shipped this change that said, hey, if you just log back into the Farcaster app, we'll set everything up, we'll migrate all your data for you, we'll re-sign them so that they're all available on hubs. And everyone who's signed in after in the call it like the last 3 months, we've been upgrading all their data, broadcasting it to hubs, and so on. There's some set of people that just have not returned in the last 3 months. They signed up early. Some of them have potentially lost their seed phrase and got a new account. Some of them have churned and are no longer using. Some of them just haven't checked the app in a while. We do need to figure out what to do with this situation, because this is again in that category of data that's available over Warpcast APIs that won't be available on hubs. It's stale data. None of these people are by definition active. It's mostly stuff from 3 months ago, so it's not showing up in feeds or anything, but it is data. And so the first thing that Warpcast has been doing is running an email campaign to get everyone to sign back in. So over the last 7 days, we've sent 3 emails saying like, hey, you need to sign back in to upgrade your data, you need to migrate, and that's nudged some percentage of users to come back and actually upgrade all their data. Now the question is, what should we do going forward? Because there's no guarantee that all of these people will come back. And then there's always this divergence between Warpcast APIs and Farcaster data. And that's kind of annoying for everyone on the network to have to use both APIs. So the proposal that we have, and we want to get feedback from the community on this, is one, continue these notifications. Like we'll send out, I think we sent out the last one yesterday. And then if the user has not come back, their account is still valid, their account is still in like a correct state. If they log back in, they'll be able to start posting, but we will just pull all the older messages from the Warpcast API and from the Warpcast client. So there's no special data on Warpcast that doesn't live in hubs, but if the user comes back and becomes active again, all their new data will get migrated and broadcast to hubs correctly. So if the user reactivates, I think we're good. There's a second thing, which is verifications. So when you link your blockchain account or your Ethereum account, also has to be resubmitted in the new format. So some of y'all have already called this out, is there's a lot of older users who have connected it in the V1 days who haven't gone ahead and upgraded it. So this is actually valid existing users, but they have to reconnect it because they need a new signature from their Ethereum account. And so we're going to do another in-app campaign and notification for this. And make sure that, nudge everyone to say like, hey, you need to reconnect your address. This will actually make it onto hubs and continue to be valid and make sure this data is accessible to everyone. And again, we need a cutoff date after which we say, okay, if you haven't re-uploaded this data, Warpcast does not want to have any special data that isn't on hubs. And so we want to go ahead and turn this off and say we will deprecate all this data. And we're proposing that it takes a little longer just because reconnecting your Ethereum wallet is a little bit more of a pain in the ass than just logging back in. And so we've said we'll do more intense notifications for that and do that by May 18th. Cool. I'll pause there and see if people have feedback or concerns about this proposal. Sounds like a general thumbs up from Greg.
I think it's worth just calling out, make sure we're going to lose a chunk of the network. This happened also in September last year when we migrated from, what was the previous testnet, Varun?
From Rinkeby. Wow.
Rinkeby to Gurley.
Almost forgot the name.
So we went through that. We lost roughly the same percentage of the network. And then people have trickled back. It's for signers, we're at 75% of total signups. So I think it's like we're going to be, 3,500 people will lose their data. But the nice thing here is that if they show back up, and we're going to have it on Warpcast, so that if they show back up, they still have their FID, and so they just kind of have to press a button, and then it'll upload the signer, and they'll be good. But I think the kind of verifications, we only have 1,500 of, call it 10,000 connected addresses that are in the proper format. I think active people will go through it. It takes 2 seconds once we actually make it a little bit nicer on web, and we're going to do some things to just kind of make this really easy. But I do think it's worth noting that, the 10,000 connected addresses, that's a pretty valuable data set as it relates. I think we can capture that as a snapshot and people can play around with it, and we may put it on GitHub or something. But from a go forward standpoint, we're going to have a lot of work we need to do to kind of rebuild that graph.
So can you just like spell out exactly, just like go through like they say 3,500 users we're losing, like is there a distribution of like how many casts of theirs that we're losing? And then I didn't quite get the point in terms of the connected addresses. If you can go through that again.
Okay, so
Sorry, go ahead.
you want to answer?
No, you got it.
Okay, so the way to think about it is there are 12,000 roughly odd FIDs. 3,500 of those FIDs do not have a V2 signer, so they cannot upload messages to hubs. So all of that data will be purged. They will be able to come back and then get started again. The revalid preference is these are people who've turned, right? Like we've sent them a bunch of emails, they haven't been back in months. So effectively not have to worry about that. I think no, FIDs will not be purged. It's only the data that's sitting in the Warpcast database, right? Because right now it's being served in an old format, and it would, if we put it on a hub, the hub would reject it because it doesn't have a V2 signer. So I can get like some list of FIDs that people can see, and then they can kind of run their own queries in a rough amount, but you can kind of view it as like these people are not active. So the cast content is not particularly relevant in terms of they haven't been using the app at all recently. The verifications, of the 10,000 connected addresses verifications, right? And we should work on the terms so it's just cleaner. But from a protocol standpoint, they're called verifications. They're in an old format that we designed before, hubs and all this other kind of stuff. Since we've rolled over, 1,500 of those are in the proper format. Most of you on this call, for example, probably have an old format. So like you would have to go just re-sign, upload. It takes 2 clicks, and then boom, like you're in the new format. We are going to run a campaign over the next few weeks, very aggressive, in-app. I'll be announcing it, sending emails, being targeted. I'll reach out manually to people who are very active on chain. But we only have 1,500 of that 10,000 in the right format. So I would imagine if we do a good job, we probably get to like 50% compliance there. That would be aggressive because it's an action people have to take. It's not an automatic. And then the protocol will actually have, to Varun's point, outside of follows, 100% of the data that is available from a protocol spec, and there's no difference between what's in the Warpcast API and on hubs.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, just because Greg had this question, to be super clear, none of these users are losing their accounts. It's just old casts from several months ago that just can't be validated, will be expired. The moment the user logs back into the app, we'll make a new signer, and every new cast they make will be broadcast straight to hub. So none of these users are getting kicked off the network or locked out in any way. So as soon as they come back, everything's going to work fine. Cool. Lester, I think you raised your hand earlier. I don't know if you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think Dan addressed it, which is I think you said the 1,500 people that haven't been active in the last 3 months. There's rarely any data on them, so we technically won't lose a lot of cast or data on the data layer because of that, right?
If you look at it as like what's showing up in feeds and notifications, there's going to be a 0% impact. If you look at like, hey, I'm going to go back and look at some inactive users' profile, then you're not going to see some of their cast. That's basically the difference. And most of this data is on hubs, by the way. So if you wanted to know, like, if somebody wanted to run an analysis on this and come back, you can just go query hubs and see which FIDs are registered on hubs but have 0 messages. Those are the users who we haven't been able to get back to produce a signer.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll keep running this, assuming we can get, like, we want to push ahead with these dates because, again, we want to make sure we get to a place where no one is reliant on Warpcast data or Warpcast specific API, and we'll keep checking in every protocol meeting and letting you guys know how things are progressing.
Sorry, Dan, the last point you wrote here, 8,500 people will lose their connected address. What is that?
So when you connect your Ethereum address, right? So we generate with Warpcast, everyone gets a new wallet. That's the Farcaster address. The onboarding process has an optional step. When you all probably signed up, it was required. We've since made it optional back in February, I think, where you can connect an address, right? Like your .ENS with all your NFTs to your Farcaster account. Up until recently, that was in a V1 format that did not comply with what hubs have, right? Because it's a not double signed. Like you can look at the protocol spec of like why we improved it the way we did. Since we flipped over, 1,500 of those addresses that have been connected are in the right format, and then 8,500 are these legacy addresses, right? So a good example, Dom Hoffman, created Loot, all this stuff. He signed up almost 2 years ago now. He has a V1 address. Warpcast is putting that out there and people can actually use it. When we move to the new system, if he doesn't go through and click a couple times on connecting his address again, that won't go in a hub. So the set of addresses, the 10,000 that have been connected, 1,500 will go to hubs and 8,500 won't. We are going to spend the next month trying to get the number of 1,500 up to as high as the number as we can, and then there will be some number, just like the users, that won't go on to hubs.
Yep. This to me is more interesting, more important than the 3,500 dormant users. And I think it's, so if you think that the 8,500 users, let's just assume the highest case that all 3,500 the dormant users are in that 8,500, so that you have 5,000 remaining who are active users. Like getting those 5,000 users to revalidate their connected address is really important for a number of use cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So-
think the way we can work around that is, like Dan brought this point up earlier, but for the users that don't connect, we can take their V1 format. This won't exist in hubs, just hubs won't accept them as valid because it's not correct, and publish it to like some kind of open repository where it's like, hey, these are the old Farcaster V1 addresses. If you as an application want to use that for something, you're welcome to. We just haven't been able to get these people to come back and sign. And if they do come back and sign, they'll automatically be broadcast to hubs. So that way you have the data access to do things that you want to for analysis purposes.
Yeah.
And then we actually have the actual verifications on hubs.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like we build all this stuff at AirStack with the whole connected addresses, and then also build a jam with it as well. So now I think through how this factors into it.
Yeah, the way I think about it is the data isn't going away in the sense that if we publish that publicly, then there's always that. I think from a complexity standpoint of dealing with V1 versus V2, that I'm sure will be a pain in the ass. But I think from a principle standpoint, like the user has to opt in to do actions as part of the decentralization. And so we don't control that address specifically because the wallet is in a different wallet. And so if they're no longer active, that in some ways is the like, okay, that's actually the truth on the ground, is like, this is the population of people who are actually active on Farcaster with connected address.
And just to dial this sort of in, right? This is a problem we have today. It's like there's some subset of data that's going to be on hubs, and we're going to try to get that as high as possible. There's some subset of data that will always be available only on Warpcast APIs because that user has never come back. And what we're going to do is just publish that publicly to GitHub and stop serving them from Warpcast API. So we kind of like freeze it, lock it, and say, this is the old data that never made it. You can go use it if you'd like to. And if the user comes back, they'll sign it and they can use it. So from a data availability perspective, there should be no difference. There's some work needed to like read from this GitHub repo instead of the Warpcast APIs, but I actually think it should be reasonably minimal. Like we're thinking about doing something similar there too. Yeah, and you can just have this like,
I'm processing. We were going to launch some features on Jam next week that uses all the connected addresses of users. I'm thinking about how we do that.
Yeah.
Um,
And to Lester's point on the thing, I think this, like you can basically say, hey, this uses a V1 connected address, this uses a V2 connected address if you want to delineate between, hey, this is something the users opt in, or you can just kind of assume and put it into the feed. I think applications can make their own decisions there. But okay, I think if anyone has any proposals for like, we're going to run a notifications campaign, so you'll see it. All of you will probably get nudged to go and upgrade this. If you have feedback on that, if you're like, hey, here's an idea of how to make it better, we should do more notifications, et cetera, et cetera. Dan and I are open to feedback on this. We want to make sure, like, our goal is, we agree these are super, super valuable, and we're going to put a bunch of effort into nudging people in every possible way to get them to come back and add this stuff to the application. But we just inevitably know that, as with anything, when you ask people to come back and do stuff, some percentage of people won't, and we'll try to minimize that as much as possible. Okay, moving on to the FIPs. So the one that I want to touch on really quickly is kind of the meta FIP, so the proposal for making proposals. I think most of you have seen this by now. It's finalized. It just has a high level structure for like, hey, if you're writing an FIP, there's 4 stages that it goes through. There's the idea stage, where it can literally, like, you can put anything you want in a discussion. It can be open format, it can be conversational, no structure. There's a draft form where we would like for you to put it into this kind of structure where it's like easy to analyze and understand the impact of the rollout and all of the stuff. And then it can get moved to the review state when there's actually like code written and an implementation, and then people have sort of this like last call for feedback that may take a few days to a week. And then there's a finalized state where like, this is done, we've all agreed to it, we can move on, we can make amendments to it in the future, but as it stands, this is the current state of the world. And there's a stage 5 where the author can at any point say, I cancel this if they think that that's not the right standard. So super lightweight structure. We try to be as minimal as possible to encourage maximal idea flow. We didn't want to put a lot of process that prevents people from coming up with new stuff. And we're always open to feedback on this. And a few people have already commented and have already opened new FIPs in this format. So thank you for doing that. If there are no questions on this, I want to move on to Paul's first proposal for multi-signatures. Okay, Paul, you want to give a 30-second preview for this and any asks for the group?
Yeah, can you just click on the link there? This is relatively low level, so I'll keep it brief and let anyone who's interested dig into the actual issue. But right now, a message is sort of this atomic unit that includes data, a hash, and a signature. And we pass around messages and store them on hubs. But when people re-sign messages, we don't store both signatures. A hub will basically store the first version of a message that it receives. And that mostly makes sense because the data is the same if the hash is the same. And so we don't want to store duplicate information. But there are a couple downsides with this approach. The current approach, in terms of especially like removing signers and transferring FIDs. And so this is a proposal where hubs would store not just the first version of a message that they receive, but each additional signature that they receive. And so a message becomes data and a hash with these signatures, and a message is only revoked when all of its signatures end up being revoked, which means there'll be much less thrash on the network when a signer is revoked or an FID is transferred. We're still trying to figure out all of the API changes and like implications from a client perspective or the hub event stream perspective, but this is sort of the high level version of it.
Yeah. The important thing for app developers is I think getting this done will unlock a really nice feature, which is today, if a user wants to, let's say they want to change their Ethereum address that holds their FID, you would have to revoke all of their messages. You basically transfer the FID on chain. The hubs would go, hey, the signers are no longer valid because they don't come from there. They would sort of revoke all the messages, and then you would rebroadcast all their messages with a new signer, and it would create for like a few seconds this really annoying thrash where your account goes to 0 and then comes back and gets populated, and it would create a bunch of like network traffic. This new proposal allows you to pre-sign it and say, hey, I'm going to move to this address. I'll produce a signature from, from something on this address, and then have everything kind of more smoothly migrate over. So as Paul said, super low level change. If you are interested in this kind of stuff and have feedback, we'd love to talk to you about it. And we would love to, we're shooting to get this into the next release of Hub, so 5.31. So Paul is actively working on this right now. Okay, second low-level change that we want to touch on really quickly is from Sanjay, which is about the canonical serialization. So this is the, we talked about this a couple of meetings ago, but this is the problem that prevents us from being able to implement hub interfaces in other languages easily, because there's something special about the way one of the JavaScript gRPC libraries does things. And Sanjay, do you want to give a quick 30-second overview of this one for folks that are interested?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Sanjay. I joined Merkle early this month working on just protocol stuff. But okay, so to get into this FIP, basically, as Varun mentioned, at a high level, what's happening is like the way we verify our hash for the message is dependent on how TS proto CLS is protobufs. So if you try to submit like a protobuf message CLS from like some other library, in some cases it won't work because the hubs will think the hash is invalid when like it really is valid. What we're doing is like we're just like changing how we validate that data. So we're going to change the protobuf format from like a message data type of the data to just treat it as bytes. And then this way, like we just don't care like what it looks like at a high level when we verify the hash. It shouldn't have any implication for like any consumers except like like the type is changing from like message data to bytes. It's still the same underlying message data protobuf type, but when you write it to the message type, you would just write it as like a stream of bytes. Yeah.
Yep. The thing that this unlocks is, again, developers can now easily generate libraries for their own languages. It's not going to be complete, but Jason, I don't know if this changes your team's perspective on whether they want to do their Node service first or the Golang service first, but this might make it a little easier to start writing the Golang service than it is today. Okay, cool. Any questions on that before we move on to some of the other proposals?
This will also need the hash migrations of the older messages.
No, because we're just treating it as bytes, like it's completely backwards compatible. Yeah.
It's actually a really nice solution that Sanjay found, which is there would be no impact to hashes or anything else going backwards, and everything will just kind of work going forwards once this change is rolled out. Sweet. Jason, I think you had the next agenda item, which was the embed proliferation. I sort of call this a new FIP. It might be an extension to one, it might be a new one, but I'll let you give the overview.
Yeah, I don't have, I mean, I kind of had some thoughts on a specific proposal, but the idea that basically came about that we were starting to have a lot of different types of embeds. And we spent a lot of time this week kind of playing catch up to them, just kind of seeing a new embed and seeing, okay, there's like example, like, something new in WordCast, but in Jam, we can't render it, or we're not sure how to render it. So when users see the cast in Jam, it's, either there's no URL, there's no image or whatever it might be, and trying to figure out, okay, what do we do here? If it's a URL, we're able to parse it and render it as a standard like OG format, but if it's like a URI, we don't know what to do with it yet, right? So like, and there'll be others, and we're all creating them. And I think like right now, I think I counted like 8 different types, but there probably like can be hundreds of them in the near future. And I was just thinking about how do we all kind of help each other and get organized on them so that we can, put together a good little process so that we're not kind of finding about it first in our feeds, and so as an example, like for instance, I'm guilty of this, right? So we have during this call, we launched multiple photos on Jam, right? And so we're going to send 2 photos through embeds, and WordCast isn't yet able to render them, and other clients as well. And so Like we're following the standards of the embeds, but now we get to like, how do you give a heads up to people that like this is coming so they can decide for themselves how they want to prioritize it and what to do with it. So yeah, and so I'll tell you on our side, one of the things I asked Aman to look at this week was, you know, as we start reading everything from hubs, could we build a way to sniff out something that we don't know how to render? And so that we're not seeing it in the feed first, but we're actually, you know, kind of a way to kind of identify it. And then even potentially is that somebody could open source for others to use as well, as a way just like to, you know, get a sense for new types of content coming through hubs. So let's say Audius has music clips coming or something like that, that everyone, you know, is able to sense that it's coming and decide how to react to it. I don't have a great answer for how to respond to this. I was just trying to, I suggested maybe we create something, whether it's in GitHub or somewhere where it's like a table or repository where whenever someone launches a new embed, they at least follow a format to kind of alert everyone else to it. So like for ours today, we would fill out a form or something like that, or with like what we did today with the multiple photos, and then other people could look out for it, see an example for it, and decide what they want to do with it. But also have a central place to come back to and see all the different types of embeds that have been launched.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on this, but if anyone else in the group has feedback, I'll let them go first.
I think this is going to be very useful because we at Farcaster we're also thinking about launching on on-chain votes as embeds. Right now we are only publishing URLs because we want it to be rendered in every single client. But we want to move beyond that because the URL at this moment points to alphacaster.xyz. Right? So if someone goes to Gem, they probably want to see it natively in the app. So we have two potential options. One is we would do it as a photo. So instead of publishing an URL, we would publish a photo that would basically a screenshot of someone's votes, or even better, we could use the URI or like the on-chain transaction as our embed. And also we put we would put basically two embeds, the URL and the URI, and a client can choose which one to render. On Alphacaster, we're going to put the link because obviously it points to Alphacaster. But to other clients, they can choose how they want to do it, and then they can render the URI in the way they want. So I think this is going to be very helpful.
Cool. Let
Also,
me add oh, sorry. Someone else is going to go.
Sorry, I just saw Paul said votes are reactions rather than canvas embeds. What do you mean?
So one of the ideas, this would have to be another FIP, but one of the ideas that we had a while ago is right now reactions are really like locked down in terms of what like the reaction types. You can only like something and recast something right now. But really like a reaction is sort of this, it's just an action which has a target of a cast or of really any like URL now. And so rather than making one idea might be rather than making a vote a cast with an embed, instead like having everyone agree to unlock reaction types so that you can have a vote reaction type or some long list of arbitrary reactions.
Would
Yeah,
that be,
this guy go. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bill.
just want to ask, would that be kind of like the equivalent of GN, GM, and like the noun goggles? Like whenever there's something inside embedded into the text, it converts it into that?
Yeah, I think we should write out the FIP. I think there's a range from like today it's very strongly typed in narrow, and it's like you must get this approved in order to put a type in there, to a very open-ended one where it's like, hey, you can just put any Unicode character in here and we'll interpret it. So polls are just by default voting 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I think the trade-off there is like client complexity. And I think this ties back into our question if like you can support any Unicode character you like, but every other client has to like know what you're doing and supporting, and that adds more complexity. Or you can have these narrowly typed things, which then restricts what clients can do, but makes it easier for clients to be compatible. Let me actually come back to Jason's point and make sure that we have like a framework for dealing with this. So I actually think, just reading this, Jason, there's two separate problems. One is like a protocol level problem, which I think we should have, and we have sort of an opinion on, and the other is a client coordination problem, which I think is a status of some clients are not necessarily like, clients have bugs, they're not following the spec correctly yet, and it's just like we got to work through and fix all this stuff. So from the protocols perspective, I think there's kind of like three layers. One is there's this notion of embeds, and people can put anything in there. They can put any kind of string, and inevitably people will put junk in that nobody knows how to render. And so all clients need to have a baseline defensive mechanism of, if I see junk in here that I don't know how to render, here's what I do with it. Valid options are just hide the whole cast, because it's like, I don't know what to do. Show the text of the cast, and then show a thing that says unknown. I don't know what to do with this. Those are both fine, and I think reasonable options. I think all clients should build that defensibility into their thing, because inevitably things will get messed up. I think clients should not do the thing where they show the text and not the embed, because I think that elides valuable information that they might have wanted. Either you show it and say it's missing, or you don't show it at all. I think those two options are fine. I think one level higher is like, okay, the next step the protocol wants to make sure is that every embed has a format that is natively renderable in some fallback way. So the nice thing about HTTP URLs is, if you get an HTTP URL, you can do the Open Graph preview. That's kind of the base. Like, everyone can do this with every URL. Super simple integration. We can all have this, and there's no case where a URL doesn't have some representation on the product. And then similarly, we are adding other types like capes, where we're saying, hey, this is a cape URL, and so this represents. Today we have just NFTs. So here's a way to represent Ethereum NFTs, but we can go in here and we can add other things. We can say like, hey, here's a way to represent Ethereum transactions. And so when we add these to the protocol level in FIP1, the expectation is that now every client should support some version of this, or should say, hey, we don't care about this type. We choose not to implement or support it, and we will say it's unsupported, or we'll just hide it. So I think this is the sort of like rendering level cape where we say like, yep, all clients should support this. I think there's a third level where individual clients may enhance these things with like extra features. Like you may go and scrape the web page and actually show a photo preview of the web page instead of the Open Graph tag. I think that's fine, and I think that's actually a surface area for client experimentation. And so that might result in content looking a little different from client to client, which it always will, right? Like, you have different sizes, different boxes, whatnot. But at least everyone this way knows that if somebody else puts something in here that aligns with these things, I have a way of making sure there's some reasonable representation of that data in my platform. And that's kind of how we think about it from the Farcaster perspective. And so, like, right now we support HTTP and NFTs. And to take AlphaCaster as an example, Bill, if you wanted to say, hey, I want to put the transaction in there because the transaction is the vote, we would make a new FIP for transactions. We'd give everyone a heads up that AlphaCaster is doing this, and then we'd go ahead and add it. Now, if AlphaCaster suddenly wanted to change the rendering for that, they're like, hey, rather than showing this, Etherscan link, we will like make this super fancy and show like the past votes and stuff like that. You don't need to come to anyone for permission. You can tell everyone because that's nice, but that's kind of your just syntactic UI on top, and you can go change that to whatever you want, and everyone else can still render the low level thing, and then they can catch up and do the high level thing later. That's how we think about it from a protocol perspective, is like base level composability and pluggability, and then every client can experiment on top.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'd be happy to create a FIP for that.
Okay, the one thing, so we'd be very open to FIP for transactions who want to do it. The one thing that I wanted to call out on your proposal, Bill, is I think you were saying, hey, we'll give 2 links and like clients can choose which one to render. I think that level of encoding actually becomes really hard, because now you're encoding rules about like, actually, this is not a render both, this is a render either or, and then clients have to start having all of this complex logic. And I think the way we're thinking about it from Warpcast perspective is we want to be super dumb. We support this stuff, and if we get a message from another client saying, hey, there's 2 things, we'll just show both the things, and we'll say this is what the client intended to show. Because trying to divine like, oh, like this client meant that we should show one but not the other, but this client meant that we should show both, it's really hard for us to encode all those rules on each client.
I want to add 3 points to what Varun said. So the first is just given how much distribution Warpcast has right now, I think one commitment we want to make is we are going to follow whatever is put into the FIP process. And anytime there's a bug in doing that, like, please let us know. So I think like great example here is Jason. I think the third one you cited, that was just that was like a bug in the sense that we were rendering the cape, which someone actually had pasted into the body, and we were just auto detecting it and making it. But I think that is confusing, because if you actually look at what the FIP says if you don't put it as an embed, what the user is indicating, and actually this is just to make sure everyone's baseline, Twitter has the same thing. The user indicating putting a link or something in the body of a cast text is saying, please render this as text. Like I don't want any special syntactic sugar. That's my intent. Whereas if it gets put as an embed, that's a signal to a client, go crazy. Like do whatever you want with that embed based on your interpretation of it in experiment. And so I think that like getting to that point where Warpcast is really, really respecting that as a rule, I think can really help people understand. It's like, okay, I can experiment with embeds because that actually I know how it's going to render every single time when it ends up on Warpcast. And I think the second thing is links. I actually think are the way to do this, the fallback. And the example here is the Mint link Open Graph stuff that we did with Zora and Highlight, and now OpenSea and a bunch of others, Manifold, have all adopted. The nice thing about putting that link as an embed is it'll render in every client that can handle Open Graph. And then anyone who wants to actually dig into a little bit more of the Open Graph, they can render it even more complexly, right? But the nice thing is, so if you were to take a transaction, right, like an Farcaster transaction link, that gets put in as the embed, every client's going to be able to render that out of the box, right? Like they don't even have to think about it. And then if you're actually adding additional Open Graph tags of like the transaction related information, that allows other clients, if they want to support those, or they're saying, wow, a lot of people are sharing Farcast links, I'm going to actually improve that. But I think it's worth delineating that part of the process is the FIP process should be about like, hey, these are the actual like core things that people will be putting in embeds versus I have a link and I know that there's like other information on this page that I can kind of extract and make it look really nice in my client. Those are, I think, two separate processes, right? And so really, really respecting the FIP, and that's something that we can be doing better at Warpcast, like especially with this bug, like really getting to a place where we're going to follow whatever the set of embeds that we agree. So to the degree that someone proposes, like Jam proposes a long cast standard for an IPFS hash or an Arweave transaction, and it gets consensus at the protocol, we're going to go about implementing that in Warpcast in some way so that those links don't or those embeds don't look bad in Warpcast, right, at some point. So like I think that's the process that we really want to drive, is separating what gets actually put into the protocol versus what gets rendered in the clients should actually be a full canvas for experimentation. And the use of links as the way to do fallback, I actually think is going to be the fastest iteration, while guaranteeing that all other clients is going to have at least some way of rendering it.
Yeah, I think that's great, Dan. And I also think like there's such a huge opportunity here. And we could put together like a little documentation that everyone could use on how to go out to other partners and players in the Web3 space. We could create hundreds or thousands of different types of these links. And it's can be a really interesting way to grow the whole Farcaster network.
Yep. This kind of jumps to an agenda item down here, but let me just cover it quickly. So I have an action item here to take the Open Graph thing that Zora and a bunch of others implicitly started doing and just turn it into an FIP and make a process for upgrading it. So the general frame to think about this FIP is, hey, I have a URL that actually does not represent content on the web. It represents content on a blockchain. And here is a way where I can provide you a pointer to that content on the blockchain and my meta tag so that you can go and render whatever you'd like on it. So it's basically translating web pages that are representations of FIP1 objects into FIP1 objects. And the first proposal is for NFTs, but we'll leave it open-ended so you can come in and like any new standard, you can kind of add it in there. And that I think will be like a nice big unlock for everyone. Okay, so tactical action items on this. I think from the Warpcast side, Warpcast is going to go fix the two things that are not working correctly. One, which will be done, sooner. We'll probably be getting like these embeds not render where they should not be rendered. One, which we want to do, will just take a little more time because it's an involved UI change, is supporting multiple image embeds, like the protocol says 2, so Warpcast will support 2. That just may take a little longer because of the amount of work involved for us. Second takeaway, I think Bill, I think you guys can launch this with casts if you like. I think to Paul's point, there might be something really powerful we can do with polls and with reactions. So we should talk about it. I don't want to hold you guys up if you're like, hey, we're ready to launch this. Maybe you can even evolve it into this new design, but it's something that's been on the back of our minds and we just haven't, I mean, we've just been tied up with this, so we haven't prioritized. So if you're excited about writing that FIP, Paul and I at least would be happy to support, get that done. And I think it could be done in a way that is a general poll concept that like every client can now go and implement in some way. But being realistic, it will probably take at least 1 to 2 releases, which means 6 to 12 weeks to actually ship into hubs and get everyone to support it. So that's probably the timeline around that. And then Jason, does that cover all the concerns that you have? Does it feel like a reasonable process? Okay, cool. Reading Paul's comment, just to confirm, do we want all Cape URIs sent as embeds or URLs that support the on-chain meta tags? Paul, I'm not sure I quite follow that.
Like if someone is like if someone's pasting a Zora URL into a cast, do we expect like collectively clients to embed the Zora URL or to embed the Cape?
It's a good question, and I don't think we are going to be super prescriptive on it from a protocol level of like, hey, here's what you should do as a client, because I think it's hard to determine in the abstract, right? Like if a Zora link perfectly maps to an on-chain object in a Cape, it might make sense to do a Cape. But I can imagine a case where a Zora link actually maps to 2 or 3 on-chain objects, and then it's like, no, I actually wanted to show you this weird collection that I have, not this actual Zora link. So I don't think we can go and prescriptively say, hey, everyone should do this. I think like clients have to determine based on links and based on working with these other websites, like how that translation actually happens.
I think the simplest way to think about it, and this goes back to Bill's point about like having fallbacks, because this is actually something I brought up with Varun. I'm like, oh, why don't we just use 2 and you get to pick the first one? And he explained all the reasons that are like, this is going to create a lot of complexity for developers. Is the link, the URL is the universal fallback, right? That is the green bubble here. And if there's additional information you can pull out of a URL that informs how you might render it even better, that I think is pretty powerful, because then you know that if you're a new developer, you can show up and you look at this list of like the core FIPs that are like, you know, these embeds types. Right now, the only thing you have to learn how to do is a URL, which that's like a basic social app. And right now we have a Cape 19, which is an NFT. And one developer might say, you know what, I hate NFTs. Like I'm not fun. Like no NFTs in my app. And you just don't show any of those casts. Like that's like your determination. And I imagine the types that are actually supported at the protocol level all the time, it'll grow, but it won't be like a crazy number, like because it takes some time to build consensus and whatever. And I think where the experimentation is going to happen is people are going to, AlphaCaster is going to launch the transaction link that when it shows up on AlphaCaster, because it has some additional information, it's going to look really great. And then maybe Discov and Jam are both doing it, and Warpcast is just still a link, right? Whereas, you know, Jam might do the long cast stuff, and on Jam now it just like instant tap, it shows, and then Discov adopts that, and we don't necessarily have that. But then other clients say, hey, we should just actually make these Rweaver IPFS hashes part of the protocol. And in doing that effort to kind of build that rough consensus and working code, then the other developers that are kind of respecting the FIP process, which we should be doing that at Warpcast, are going to now make a priority to say, okay, because an Rweave hash or a IPFS hash is a native FIP, like we've added it to the canonical list, we're going to do a better job of making sure that this gets rendered correctly. So you don't even have to think about putting it as a link because of the potential for fallback. Vern, is that an accurate summarization of how you're thinking?
I think that's a good analysis. Bill, yeah, no, I think that's great. Bill, sorry, if you put a Cape as an embed, where does the link come from? Are you talking about how do we get the Cape link?
Yeah, so if I put Cape in the embed, and then there needs to be some agreement on how to convert this Cape into a link, right? Or am I not getting this?
So just to make sure I'm communicating correctly, the way we say that there's like two right now, the FIP says there are 2 links everyone should be able to render. One is a URL. So if you get a URL, you render it usually as an Open Graph thing. And the second is if you get a Cape link, you should know how to render that as a Cape object. And you can choose if you want it to be clickable, this is totally an option for you. You can choose how you would like it to be clickable. The simplest way is to say, hey, open it in Etherscan. A more interesting way is say, open it in OpenSea or Zora or any of these other places. Another option is to say, render it in my own application. I will pull the data from OpenSea and Zora and show you like a really, really nice preview. I think all of those are acceptable forms of rendering and linking, and clients can choose what to do, but clients know that they should support some version of this cape.
Bill, here's an example. Let's say, Farcaster is growing. Blur is like, great. We're going to build the pro NFT trader client. And we show you every NFT cast and whatever. And anytime there's a cape, we're just going to render it in Blur because we want you to buy it through Blur, right? And I think like similarly, Once Upon, which is a competitor to Etherscan, might say, we're going to build the on-chain analysis client. And anytime we see a cape, anytime we see an Ethereum transaction, if we add that into the FIP level, we're going to render it in a way that is much more native and integrated. Even if the original user on a different client was like, I want you to go to this thing. Now, the way to get around that, I think, is you would just post it as a link, right? Because then it's like kick it out to that client. So I think that there's going to be some nuance here. And so I think we just have to keep kind of iterating. But I think like the simple way to think about it is things that get put into the protocol, FIPs, that's going to take more effort and that's going to change less frequently. And there will be more advanced notice, right? Because we kind of go through this process and it'll be on the dev calls and hopefully we get better at communicating that out. But I think there will be a lot of innovation, permissionless innovation, which I think is a good thing, that happens with basic URLs, whether it's Open Graph or some other standard that happens over time. And I think what we're also trying to do now that we have this is codify a little bit of this, like call it the Ethereum extension or Farcaster extension to Open Graph, which if you actually look into Open Graph, Twitter has extended Open Graph. Facebook runs it, it's in a Facebook group. But the most important tags in Open Graph today are the Twitter media card links, because when you get it on Twitter, you get we render the big images on Farcaster based off of Twitter.
Sorry to jump in here. I just want to make sure we cover the last item before our time runs out here. So you okay with just moving on to the next item and handling all the other stuff async?
Sorry, can I just say one more thing on this, real quick? Because I do think, Dan, your point about if you have a URL, then everyone can handle it. But if you have a cape, then there's more work involved, is kind of what Bill was pointing to as well. And that's why I think Paul, in your proposal, which I thought was really good, would be really careful about the process by which we accept new capes in, and make sure everyone's aligned to that. Because right now with the capes that Warpcast is submitting, it's breaking in our apps. And so I think we need a better process of figuring out, like in the future, okay, everyone, guys, here's a new cape that's been accepted and it's gonna be launched, in some period of time, and everyone should get ready for it, prepare for it. But right now it's breaking on our apps, and we need to play catch up to it. So we should try to keep those to a minimum.
Yeah, I think that's we're all aligned on that, is like we want to introduce capes. But just to be super clear, I think most of the issues that you pointed out, Jason, were like results of bugs, not results of adding a new cape. It was like we're rendering them incorrectly in Warpcast, and so it's more of a bug level thing that we're introducing a bunch of new types, because there are only two types that have ever been introduced: URLs and Cape 19s.
Yeah, but if you send a push notification to a user on Warpcast now and say, hey, you minted this NFT, share it, right? We don't know how to render that on our app yet. Now we know in the protocol how to do it, but we just haven't had a chance to implement it yet.
Yep. Yeah, totally. And so I think the process of adding new types like URLs, capes, we will have some cadence on this and make sure that we're adding it at something, and then after that we go. Yeah, Bill, I think the fallback kind of goes to like, hey, you can have two things, but in a client, like the clients may just not know when and how to choose between fallbacks. Like they may just say, hey, I'm gonna render this thing. And so you may just end up in a situation where some clients render your image and the cape embed, and that may or may not be the experience that you want. But I think the general mental model that I think is makes it life easy for clients is if they're N embeds, they're going to be M things rendered under the cast. Or anytime we start saying like if one then do the other, then all clients have this like super complex branching logic, and then that just will result in a lot of bugs and like confusing user experiences across different apps. Okay, great. I know we're at time. I'm gonna try to cover the follow graph stuff for folks that can stay on, just so we have this recorded on YouTube and we can keep the conversation going as needed, both in calls and in discussions. I want to summarize like where we are in this proposal. So this is still very much in the idea stage. We want to kind of get it to draft stage. So focus is like now getting enough technical detail in there and enough consensus built around it that we can actually move forward. The urgency behind this is one, again, going back to we want to get off Workcast APIs. And so follows is the last bit of data that a lot of people are reliant on Workcast APIs that are not available in the hubs. So the sooner we get some version of this data into the hubs, the sooner everyone can say, yes, I can be fully decentralized, self-sovereign, bring on the permissionless signups. So that's kind of why we want to get something out that we can then evolve in the right direction. The other thing is, I think like this is not a set in stone. This is the only thing we'll do. There's ways to extend. There's ways to evolve the protocol, and I'll go through some of those in a second. And the kind of summary, just looking at the thread this morning, I know there's some posts that came in like 2 minutes before this chat, but just the general summary seems to be, most people are like favoring follows. There's a couple of votes for amps and a couple of votes that are like it's unclear which side they're falling on right now. So it doesn't seem like this is a horrendously bad idea. So it feels like we can move forward in some direction. I wanted to talk about a few things. So one, Jason, I think you had this proposal, which I liked, and I think directionally we're aligned with, which is, hey, can we actually add more like types? Like, why is it like just to follow? Can't it also express like different kinds of relationships between users and objects on the protocol? And I think directionally that's where we want to go. So we already built reactions in this way, where you can actually express different kinds of relationships between people. And then we will, but reactions are a thing where it's like, they expire, like they go away after 3 months and you have more data, whereas follows don't expire. So we will also build follows in a way where it can be extended. So we'll have some higher order name for it. Like, let me just make up something. I'll call it links, and a type of a link is a follow, and we will launch it with one type, and then you can come in and add more types in the future. There's also another way we can do it where we can make it more generalized, where like the type is actually just a flexible string and you can type in the word follow and do it. And tomorrow you can come in and type in a different word, and that'll give apps more flexibility. Some trade-offs between those two different designs. So we'll cover that as well. Okay. And then the last piece of feedback is 1K limit feels too low. We'll provide some data on this and make a decision. Like, we're open to changing that number. 1K was just an initial proposal to get feedback on where people are. And then the next step is for me to write up the DevX proposal for like, what work do clients actually have to do to handle the two problems that I called out, and we'll try to build consensus on that. Okay, I think a lot of folks have to drop, so we'll pause here and we will continue in a future call. Thanks everyone for joining. And if there's any other topics we didn't get to that you'd like to see covered, feel free to drop it in chat or on one of the dev channels.